Okay, so we're going to continue on with pulmonary function. And in this video, we're going to talk about spirometry and more practically how we measure lung function. Now, we're going to do this in class as well, but at least we'll have this material here to at least set the basis for it. So when we're measuring lung function, really what we're looking to see at, and there's a few things we can look at, is how well air moves in and out of the lungs over some amount of time. And so spirometry is one way we can do that. Now the spirometer, we can actually thank John Hutchison, who you can Google him if you want. He actually invented the spirometer nearly 100 years ago. Interesting little tidbit about him. But when he invented it, the idea wasn't so much to measure lung function. He was really actually trying to measure how well someone could breathe because he knew it related to how long they'd live, basically. He actually sold insurance, in case you cared. And so he used this test. He built a spirometer. Back then it was called the Bell spirometer, where he took a bell, basically a big tube filled with water, took a smaller tube filled with water, put one inside the other, and allowed a person to breathe through a tube into this canister of water. So then the little tube would go up and down as air went in and out. He then took some paper, put it on a third canister, had the canister kind of spin at a certain rate, which he did this time, and then he can measure volumes as the volumes went up and down. Ironically enough, the technology has not changed much over a century. We still use, in fact, Bell spirometers. You can go on eBay, you can find them, they still exist. We use a little bit more higher technology, but the concept is still the same, that we can utilize a device to measure lung volumes. And so let's start with understanding what some of these lung volumes are. First of all, right now, and that's right now, it's just kind of all, it's just breathe normally. Just in and out, nice and normal. We call this normal breathing, inspiration, expiration. We call that tidal volume. And we call it that because it looks like tides, up and down. Tidal volume typically for most people is about half a liter, a little bit more if you're taller, a little bit less if you're shorter. But that tends to be pretty standard at rest. And so all of us, as I'm speaking, are breathing tidal volume. Now, if I were to ask you to then inspire as much as you possibly can, what we would see is that on a curve, you would inspire. So you couldn't inspire anymore right there. And that would be called your inspiratory reserve volume, or IRV for short. This inspiratory reserve volume. Now, IRV, that's your maximum inspiration. So that is the volume from tidal volume to inspiratory reserve volume. And then if you were to expire all of that and keep going through tidal volume until you can't breathe out anymore, that volume below tidal volume would be expiratory reserve volume, or ERV. So you have inspiratory reserve volume, expiratory reserve volume. Now you'll probably notice with these that there is this little volume here on the bottom. Let's get my cursor. There's a little volume here on the bottom that we haven't talked about. We call that residual volume. And actually, even after a maximal inspiration, we do still have air left in our lungs. It's about a liter or so, maybe a little bit more than that for most people. We call this residual volume. And as much as you may try, that is the volume of air that remains in your lungs. Even more specific, it's the volume of air that remains trapped in your alveoli after a maximum expiration. So really it's the alveoli that are causing residual volume, not any of the larger or smaller airways. What happens is as you expire maximally, the small airways around the alveoli collapse, and because of that, air gets trapped in the alveoli. And that's not a bad thing. Actually, keeping residual volume is actually a good thing. That actually protects your lungs from noxious gases that could get into the alveoli. So it's actually a good thing, but we all have it. There are lung diseases where we may see more of that, but in most people that's going to be about a liter, 1.2 liters or so. And then we have some other volumes, everything, which is IRV plus TV plus ERV. We call that vital capacity. We have inspiratory capacity, which is your IRV plus TV. Total lung capacity, which is all these lung volumes together. And so it kind of gives you an idea of the different lung volumes we have. And that is one thing we can measure when we look at spirometry. Now, that's not the only thing we can measure. And another thing we use is what's called a flow volume loop or a flow volume curve. And this is what we'll talk about in class. We'll demo this in class, where not only can we measure volumes, we can also measure the rate or the velocity at which you can get air to travel during inspiration and during expiration. And so we'll demo this. I'll show you sort of how we do this. But when we do a flow volume loop, it gives us this, gives us this loop as we inspire, and then a maximal expiration. It gives us what we call a flow volume loop. And from that, it gives us some really important terms. And these I want you to know, they'll be really key. Those will be on your exam. We'll go over these in class as well. The first one, and in fact it's not on here, but it's the obvious one, is FVC, which is forced vital capacity. And forced vital capacity is simply that. What's the volume of air that you can force, F, out of your lungs after a maximal inspiration? So after you breathe in, what's that maximum amount of air? We call that forced vital capacity. And so for most of you, FVC would probably be something like would be something like 4 liters, 5 liters, maybe a little bit more if you're a little taller. The next thing we look at is what's called FEV1. FEV1 is forced expiratory volume in 1 second. So this is the maximum volume of air you can expire after a maximal inspiration in 1 second. So this is the maximum air total. It's how much air you can get out in 1 second. And a really, really important number we look at is FEV1 divided by FVC. In other words, how much air can you get out in 1 second versus how much air you can get out total. And this ratio, this FEV1, FVC ratio, is really, really key. Allows us to be able to measure differences between obstructive and restrictive disorders, which we'll talk about. Some other things we can look at are FEF max, which is your maximum forced expiratory flow rate. In other words, what's the maximum rate you can get air out, expiratory out. FEF 2575 is what's the rate, not max, but in the middle of that expiration. We often call this mid-expiratory flow rate. So not at that peak, at that middle, what's the rate there? And each of these allow us to get a sense of different aspects of flow and volumes when someone's breathing as hard as they can. And this will be key because we can actually diagnose some disorders based on these numbers, and we'll talk about those in our next